Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees, here are today's top stories. Scotland launches its vaccine pass app, but users are reporting technical problems. The government faces demands for the measures to be delayed. An investigation into widespread corruption in boxing at the 2016 Rio Olympics. The report says fights were manipulated, including that of Britain's Joyce losing super heavyweight gold. And Insulate Britain block motorways again, this time hitting the M1 entry into London and the M4 near Heathrow Airport. The Metropolitan Police say officers are putting their lives at risk to quickly clear the roads. People attending nightclubs and large events in Scotland are now required to show proof they've had 2 jabs. But users report technical issues with Scotland's vaccine passport app just hours after its launch. Here's NTD's Jane Worrell with the story.
From Friday, people going to large events and nightclubs in Scotland need to prove they're fully vaccinated against COVID-19 with the NHS Scotland COVID app. Unlike other vaccine pass schemes in Europe, a negative test isn't being accepted. The Scottish Tories have called for the scheme to be delayed. Their leader earlier this week highlighted issue with the definition of a nightclub.
The definition of a nightclub is something I will focus on, because I will in one moment, Mr Mason, because at that time John Swinney, as the member responsible for this piece of legislation, couldn't define a nightclub, and in the same debate his own MSPs were Googling a definition of a nightclub. And now it has been established what the Scottish Government believe a nightclub to be in terms of this legislation. We know from the hospitality industry that it will be far more wide-ranging than anyone expected.
Scottish Labour's health spokesperson calls the app a complete shambles. Scotland's First Minister confirmed there'll be a grace period for the scheme.
We intend to allow a further period of slightly more than 2 weeks until the 18th of October before any business could face enforcement action for non-compliance.
But hours after the app's launch, many are reporting issues with it. Error messages posted on social media read, "Something went wrong, we're working on it." Roddy Dunlop QC, Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, says, "But try the app, this is literally the worst app I have ever tried to use." The Scottish Government says the tech glitches happened because of an influx of people trying to use the app at the same time. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
An investigation shows corruption was widespread in boxing at the 2016 Rio Olympics. The report says matches were manipulated, including the bout that saw Britain's Joyce lose super heavyweight gold. NTD's Cost Temenes brings us this report.
A report commissioned by boxing's world governing body IBA says there was match manipulation at the 2016 Rio Olympics. Head of the investigation, Richard McLaren, says probably 10 or 11 matches were suspicious. They include the gold medal heavyweight bout between Russia's Evgeny Tishenko and Kazakhstan's Vasily Levit. Tishenko won the gold medal to a chorus of boos from the crowd on a unanimous points decision, even though Levit seemed to have landed more punches.
And we can confirm that the matches that the media was interested in and talked about at the time in 2016 were manipulated matches, but we can't go further than that at this point.
Another Rio fight called into question was the super heavyweight final between Britain's Joyce and France's Tony Yoka, with the latter taking gold. McLaren says the seeds of manipulation and corruption were sown throughout the Olympic Games of the 21st century, including London 2012. He says most of the corrupted officials are no longer working in the sport.
But a few are working in the sport, for sure. And they will have to be, their conduct will have to be reviewed by their Boxing Federation's disciplinary commission.
McLaren says the manipulation structure was made possible because key personnel decided the rules did not apply to them. He says matches were manipulated for money, perceived benefit of IBA, or to thank national federations and their Olympic committees. and on occasion they were manipulated to thank hosts of competitions for their financial support and political backing.
It's when you allow people to build their own internal infrastructure that is not within the rules and then corrupt people in terms of manipulating matches. Much harder problem to get at.
McLaren says IBA's then-president Wu Qingkuo bears ultimate responsibility for the failures of officiating at Rio and the qualifying events. Wu, from Taiwan, was suspended before stepping down in 2017. One of the bouts labelled suspicious by McLaren is the bantamweight quarter-final between Ireland's Michael Conlan and Russia's bronze medalist Vladimir Nikitin. Conlan lost on a controversial split decision, going on an expletive-laden rant on live television after the loss. He says he's delighted at the report's findings.
If I'm going to be honest, the news to me was a shock. I didn't think, I thought it was all put to bed and it was finished. There was nothing really going to happen, but here we are 5 years later and, probably coming to a final close, which is great.
Conlan was the reigning world and European champion. Nikitin was so badly injured that he was unable to fight in the semi-final, but he still collected a bronze medal.
I want my medal. That's what I'll feel that justice has been done when they send me that medal in the post. Let's not even go to Switzerland if they want to hand me it there.
McLaren says if IBA takes disciplinary action or declare the match result the other way, the results could be reallocated. Costa Menes, NTD News.
The exams regulator says exam results are expected to return to pre-pandemic levels in 2 years' time. This comes as this year's top grades surged to a record high, with critics calling it grade inflation. Pupils taking their GCSEs and A-levels next year, though, are expected to face more lenient grading. They'll be given a choice of topics to make up for disruption from the pandemic and lockdowns. Climate group Insulate Britain is blocking motorways again today. This time, they target the M1 entry into London at Brent Cross and the M4 near Heathrow Airport. NTD's 88 Ken has the details.
Protests by climate group Insulate Britain affect traffic on the M1 and M4 motorways on Friday morning. It's their 10th day of protests in the past 3 weeks. The organisation says its activists blocked roundabouts at Junction 3 of the M4 near Heathrow Airport and Junction 1 of the M1 at Brent Cross, North London. Some protesters glued their hands to the ground and chained themselves together using bike locks. Drivers stuck in long queues of traffic beeped their horns in frustration. The Metropolitan Police say the protesters blocked the M4 at around 8:30. The road was cleared in about 30 minutes. A senior Metropolitan Police officer says he is concerned police forces are under so much pressure to quickly clear the protests that officers are putting their lives at risk. 13 arrests were made for obstruction and conspiracy to commit public nuisance. Insulate Britain says the demonstrators include 8 released from police custody on Thursday after blocking the M25. The government obtained an injunction last week. That means anyone blocking the M25 faces a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison or an unlimited fine. Insulate Britain has pledged its actions will continue until Britain makes a meaningful statement to insulate the country's homes. The protests in London follow a similar one in Milan, Italy on Thursday. Riot police forcibly removed protesters blocking streets ahead of a visit by the Italian Prime Minister to a 3-day pre-COP26 summit. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
A group of 4 carried out an annual protest on China's National Day in Hong Kong. Dozens of police surrounded the small group, keeping them out of sight and earshot of Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam and other local government and Beijing officials who were attending the official celebration event.
I think Hong Kong is now the only place in China where diverse opinions are allowed. As you can see, the police have deployed a huge number of officers to surround a protest by only 3 to 4 people. Also, it is widely circulated among the public that over 8,000 police officers were deployed to maintain the city's security today. However, even under such pressure, we still need to hang on to our most basic civil rights, which is the freedom of speech and assembly.
4 members of the League of Social Democrats held a placard with images of pro-democracy protesters and politicians who were either jailed in recent months or had to flee to another country. Among the faces were prominent figures in the 2014 Umbrella movement, including Joshua Wong and Nathan Law. The group marched towards Hong Kong's Convention Centre, the venue of the official National Day celebration. Previous protests on the 1st of October in Hong Kong have been much larger affairs. In 2019, swathes of people came out to protest the 70th anniversary of communist rule. On that day, clashes with police involved the first police shooting of a protester. Peaceful protests were organised for today under the banner of Resist China in both London and Manchester. Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Nathan Law is seen as a contender for this year's Nobel Peace Prize. He was granted asylum in the UK last year after fleeing the former British territory. NTD's 88 Ken has more on this.
Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Nathan Law is among the contenders for the Nobel Peace Prize. Law was one of the student leaders during the 2014 Umbrella movement. The movement lasted over 2 months and paralysed the city's commercial district. He later became one of the founding members of the now-defunct political group Demosisto, along with Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow. The 28-year-old fled his home city in July last year after a sweeping national security law was imposed by Beijing. Weeks later, Hong Kong police ordered his arrest for inciting secession and collusion. The UK granted him asylum earlier this year. In 2018, Law was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by US lawmakers supported by UK MPs. The 2021 winner of the Nobel Peace Prize will be announced on October the 8th. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
Still to come, a report released in France looks at Confucius Institutes, educational programs suspected of conducting espionage for the Chinese Communist Party. France saw controversy after one of these institutes received public funding. That and more after the break. According to a French report, Confucius Institutes are facing a growing backlash around the world. Billed as educational programs, they are suspected of conducting espionage for the Chinese Communist Party. One of these institutes in France received public funding, stirring up controversy. NTD's France correspondent David Vivez has the story.
The Confucius Institute in Angers, France, will be given €40,000 by a regional council. Confucius Institutes are promoted as education centers for Chinese language and culture. They are run by Hanban, an organization under the Chinese Ministry of Education that promotes communist ideology and the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. The council's decision has been denounced by MP Guillaume Garot, who said the institute is a means of espionage for the CCP. Garot quotes a 650-page report released last week by a think tank attached to the French Ministry of Armed Forces, saying China uses networks to infiltrate foreign countries. According to the report, the Confucius Institutes allow the CCP to expand its influence and also serve as a way to build a network with local politicians. The institutes are mostly created within universities. The report also says the CCP then uses the institutes to reinforce ties with the universities. It proposes funding for the universities from Chinese groups, which allow the CCP to infiltrate the university, control the narrative on China, and even conduct espionage activities. According to the head of a local human rights association, the institute in Angers should not have received the funding.
Not all institutes are funded, but most of them receive about 35 to 40,000 euros from local politicians. There are so many associations, charities and programs for the youth that have to shut down, and yet the institute receives 40,000 euros. This is a shame.
Giraud said most of the institutes in France are funded half by public subvention and half by the Chinese communist regime via Hanban. She added that in total, 17 institutes receive about 600,000 euros a year from public funds. But according to the military report, the institutes are facing growing opposition around the world due to their reputation for espionage activity.
The director of the Confucius Institute in Brussels was arrested 2 years ago because he was suspected to be a spy. He was allegedly there to recruit spies for the CCP and has been banned from the EU for 8 years.
Giro says for years she sent letters to local politicians who support funding to the institutes, some of whom seemed friendly to the Chinese regime.
I would say I was met with a great silence from some of them.
But she says there's hope, as some cities and councils across France have suspended their funding to Confucius Institutes or even closed them. David Vives, NTD News.
Authorities began demolishing homes on Thursday in a Belgian town hit hard by floods last July. It comes as part of a £1.1 billion reconstruction plan. NTD's Joanne Robson brings us the details.
July's devastating floods in eastern Belgium were the most destructive in living memory. They turned streets into rivers, ripped up roads and collapsed houses. For Camille Bribois, the pain of seeing excavators demolish the hardest hit houses was all the greater, as his family home was one of them.
The situation for me is a difficult one from a sentimental and emotional point of view, because I was born in this house on December the 5th, 1946.
There are concerns that insurance companies won't compensate those affected.
There is a problem with people who are not sufficiently insured, or who are not insured at all. Some fear that insurance companies will seek to compensate them as little as possible.
The destruction wrought by the floods in Belgium was not as great as in neighbouring Germany, but the damage was enormous.
Water is still not suitable for drinking, electricity comes back little by little, and we're still waiting for gas. Winter is coming and we need heating and stoves. We are asking for it and we're looking for it.
Pepinster's mayor, Philippe Godin, says a lot of critical infrastructure has suffered.
Whether it is the banks, the bridges, the vehicles or the sewers, we still have a lot of work to do. It will take years.
He says a £1.1 billion loan from the federal government will be a lifeline for recovery. Joanne Robson, NTD News.
A 96-year-old woman charged with aiding and abetting mass murder in a Nazi camp was caught yesterday. The judge declared her on the run after she failed to turn up for her trial for crimes committed in World War II. Here's NTD's Lily Joel with more.
A 96-year-old German woman was caught hours after failing to turn up for her trial on Thursday. She is charged with aiding and abetting mass murder in a Nazi camp in World War II. Irmgard Foschner was a typist at the Stutthof concentration camp between 1943 and 1945. She is accused of contributing to the murder of more than 11,000 people when she was 18 years old. Court spokeswoman Friederike Milhofer.
The defendant left her home in the early hours of this morning and took a taxi to an unknown location. As a result of this flight, the chamber has issued an arrest warrant.
Milhofer confirmed that Foschner had been detained and the doctor was assessing whether her health would allow her to be imprisoned. The next hearing is scheduled for October the 19th. Charges cannot be read until Foschner is in court in person. She faces trial in an adolescent court because of her young age at the time of the alleged crimes. Although prosecutors in the 1960s convicted those who issued orders or pulled triggers, the practice until the 2000s was to leave low-level suspects alone. According to Der Spiegel, Foschner transcribed execution orders dictated by her camp commandant, who was convicted of accessory to murder in 1955. Lily Zhou, NTD News.
Rome is electing a new mayor this Sunday. Many residents are fed up with the worsening state of their city. NTD's Cos Temenes brings us this report.
abandoned parks, piles of rubbish, poor maintenance of pavements, and subway stations closed for months. Rome residents lament the decay of the eternal city. As they get ready to head to the polls to vote for a new mayor, many are blaming the current one.
In these past years, we rescued a city from the brink, a city that was left completely abandoned.
She is running for a second term, but polls indicate she might not make it to a runoff.
I am the most popular mayor, not just of Italy, but I believe I am among the most popular mayors in the world.
Some 20 candidates are running this year. Voters overwhelmingly cite rubbish collection, public transport, and weeds as their priorities. On top of that, wild animals like wild boars have become a common nuisance in the city. Raji's victory 5 years ago came largely thanks to votes from Rome's low-income outlying neighborhoods, like Tor Bella Monaca. Her reviews are mixed.
Avevo delle aspettative nella Raggi perché comunque come donna.
I expected a lot more as a woman and as a mother, but that did not happen. The periphery was left abandoned, not just Tor Bella Monaca, all the peripheries. I believe that it is true that to govern Rome would be a challenge for anyone, but it is also true that we found ourselves in a much worse situation. Yes, mistakes were made, but many good things have also been achieved. Something you can clearly touch by hand is, for example, the new buses I take when I commute to university. It wasn't like this 3 years ago.
Prominent newspaper columnist Paolo Conti says there is a general feeling among residents that the situation is now indeed worse than it was before. He says some are now almost ashamed of their city. Italians are to vote for new mayors in Rome, Milan, Naples and Turin this coming Sunday and Monday. Costa Menes, NTD News.
A solar-powered home on wheels is expected to begin its journey from Paris to southern Spain soon. It was made by a group of Dutch students who named their creation Astea Vita. NTD's Natalia Nutting has the story.
Created by a group of Dutch technology students, this vehicle is fueled entirely by solar power. With a bed and cooker inside, it's a little home on wheels. The students named it Stella Vita and say it's definitely not a traditional campervan.
We don't call it a camper, we call it a self-sustaining house on wheels, and it is because we are independent in the terms of our energy. So a camper isn't, and we are, so I think that we make something new. New concepts, new idea, new future, sustainable future.
Solar panels on the roof generate enough energy to drive and live off the grid. The students say that on a sunny day, it's capable of 450 miles with a top speed of 75 miles per hour. And thanks to its battery, it can drive hundreds of miles in the dark.
Yeah, so 60 kilowatt hour is the total capacity of the battery. And we have a solar surface of 17.5 square meters, which is quite big. It's about the same as you have on your house, but this is on a vehicle itself, so that's quite big.
The onboard information system shows how much power is available and tracks energy usage.
What's nice about this vehicle that it has a infotainment system, which actually means that it gives a great insight into your energy consumption. So it tells you, okay, I can make one more board of spaghetti, or I can drive a few kilometers more.
The team will set out to drive 2,000 miles from Paris to southern Spain as soon as the vehicle passes some final tests. They are confident Stella Vita can be on the market within 5 years. Natalia Nutting, NTD News.
Britain's 2 major lockdowns sparked a flurry of creativity, placing a renewed emphasis on the pursuit of personal projects to fill time. An Irish man recreated a traditional Irish bar in his own shed, and it has an interesting connection to the Titanic. NTD's Neil Woodrow brings us the Irish tradition.
It was September 2020, just when Northern Ireland was gradually reopening after a first strict lockdown. Northern Irishman Enda Devlin lives with his wife and 2 children in rural County Tyrone. He had a unique idea. He decided to build his own traditional pub.
The idea and the ethos behind it was to actually take skills from the business, like as master specialist decorators, and transfer them into a bar. Like, so we thought, I discussed this with my wife, and basically she did agree, in the end.
The project took approximately 1,000 hours and involved the sourcing of artefacts from as far away as France and Italy.
You understand too, they're in the lockdown situation there in the evenings, which was done over the winter time as well. Like, so it was pretty late, and it sort of worked out well. Like.
The barn was typical of those found in rural Ireland.
I'd say about a good 80–90% was bought and restored in around the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and basically what we done was we restored them all here, on site, to create the authenticity in the bar.
Consisting of a main bar area, the pub also has a lounge with a traditional turf fire. There's also a dark, cavernous seating area for card games and old tales which are only ever told in the early hours of the morning. There is a remarkable attention to detail. An old telephone sits amongst shot glasses and bottles of Irish whiskey. The bar also has an interesting connection to the Titanic.
Yeah, so this door here is a big key feature here in the bar. It actually comes from the old Harlan and Wolff's drawing rooms where they built the Titanic. Now, it was in a state of complete disrepair, so we didn't grain it back to the way it was. But the glass maintained its whole character, as you can see, and it's still in really, really good shape.
Devlin refurbished the door, painting it green while still maintaining the striking design on its window. The door in the pub even still has its bell.
There's books in there over 300 years of age and things like there's windows over there over 200 years of age as well. Like, so basically everything there has a right to be there, in creating that Irish authenticity.
A shebeen was an illicit bar where alcohol was served without a licence. The term has spread around the world but originates in Ireland. In the lounge, rows of traditional sweet jars and weighing scales occupy a corner beside the fire. In earlier times, it was not unusual for Irish pubs to sell basic groceries, in keeping with its role at the centre of a town's community. Outside the barn, a grove of apple trees encompasses the front of Devlin's house. Like the pub, Devlin has maintained them with a sensitivity to the past. He's extended the orchard and hopes to use the apples to make cider for the pub.
I've said from day one, the only thing that bar needs to do right now is go cobwebs. That's it.
Neil Woodrow, NTD News.
That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Lees.